Hi everybody. So in this particular exercise, what we're doing is creating an asymmetrical design, which is really just in some ways the opposite of an asymmetrical design. Asymmetrical designs, uh, as we're learning, require a slightly different approach than a symmetrical design. In a symmetrical design, which we did previously to this, where everything's mirroring and reflecting, you have a design that is what we call self-balancing, or what I call self-balancing. It means you don't have to, as a designer, try to balance it. They also tend to be quite formal, even though we looked at three different types of symmetry and one was formal. In actuality, they're all considered to be formal from a kind of larger bird's eye view of design, whereas asymmetrical designs are considered informal. If you just think about formal, what does formal mean? It means kind of more, kind of slightly stiffer and more kind of exacting. If you think of wearing a black tie or going to a black tie event, it's very formal and dressed up, whereas informal is like really is much more casual. And I would say that in general, most designs that we create as designers are informal. It's pretty rare, I think, to do something symmetrical, just because of what I've just mentioned is that symmetrical designs are much sort of stiffer, and in general, we're not really often looking for that. If you look at like a wedding invitation, if you could just Google one now, they tend to be formal, and that formality, what it looks like. Well, actually, let me pull one up here. So here's a perfect example of a wedding invitation. There's so many. This one right here. This one. Notice that all of them. This one is amazing. Look at that. It's very symmetrical, and there's a line down the center. All the text is centered on the page. That's actually again a rarity in design where we center text. We almost never do that except on a wedding invitation, and that's because it's difficult to read and there's just it's too much formality. So it's unfortunate that that's the case, that symmetry is not really used as much in design, because it is such a wonderful, form of balance, and it's really fun to work on because it self-balances. There's something very satisfying about it. But that's the way it is. But informal designs, or asymmetrical designs, have a lot of really interesting qualities too. And one of the things I think that is most interesting about them is that you as a designer have more room to learn about composition. I think what happens in an informal design is that you have to kind of play around with your composition, moving things around, kind of going and like taking something, maybe you move it over to the right or you change things. And what happens is at some point you look at it and you go, oh, hey, that looks really good. That seems to all work. It feels balanced. It feels resolved. It's similar to the very, remember back to our very first exercise in the class where we had the little four, frames, and you were experimenting with designs, and a lot of you worked with asymmetrical designs where you were just moving things around, and that's how you got it to look resolved. And so that's one of I think the wonderful things about asymmetrical designs is again, you can really learn about design, you know. And design really is about experimentation, isn't it? By now you've probably noticed, hey, I've just got to kind of play around with it, and this works, and this doesn't work, and this could work if I did this, and that's just it's how it kind of goes. It's like you're taking all these different ingredients, and then you're mixing them up and trying to, turn it into something that is all just somehow working together. Anyhow, okay, so that's all I wanted to say here, just kind of comment on the two different styles of balance. Now, the other thing I want to mention too is that between asymmetric and symmetric, like especially, pure symmetry, there's kind of a range. You can kind of go away from purely symmetrical and have what we call approximate symmetry, which none of you have that here. We're going to try to lean to really thoroughly asymmetric for this particular assignment, just so that we can experience it. But in the real world, you have a lot of variation between the two, and you might even have symmetrical elements within an asymmetrical design, so you can kind of really, there's a lot of different possibilities. Okay, let's get going. Yeah, and the other thing I will say too with asymmetrical designs is you almost always have a pretty clear focal point, just again sort of by nature of things being asymmetric, it focuses you in one place. Whereas in a symmetrical design, you actually can kind of, in a way, avoid having a focal point, especially in the crystallographic ones, like the patterns. Yeah, I think this looks good. I really do like what you did here, filling in the pattern into these spaces. That's a really good way to work in this class, especially, but also, in general, like you can kind of take a space, a larger space, and you can actually break it apart with a pattern. Which, let me look at our student samples. I think there was some examples there too. Hold on. Oh yeah, this is what I was thinking. This particular design, I think this is a really interesting design because, it's just made out of circles, but then within the circles, it's kind of cut out and then you see this other pattern happening in it. So it makes this larger shape. It still reads like a circle, but then you have this pattern inside. So I think it's a really interesting way to work in a design. And that's, um, hold on. So here we are. That's a little bit what you're doing here. So yeah, I think overall this looks really good. I also like you played a little bit with grayscale, which you could in this exercise. You didn't need to or have to, but it was an option you could, experiment, and that allows you to have sort of a little more kind of subtlety in the design as you go from, different forms of gray. And it's very asymmetrical. So, I only have just a few very small things here I might work on. One it looks like maybe there's a tiny little bit of a black line here. Can you see that? And I also see a little bit of a white line here. So you might want to check your file, and sometimes that just could have been a stroke that got added around your shape, and you could take that off. Sometimes it happens if you don't see that in your file, sometimes it can happen. You can maybe upload your file to your Illustrator or your Photoshop file to, I'm going to upload it to this thread or questions to the professor, and I can look at it. Because sometimes what can happen is when you save it out as a JPEG, sometimes these lines can appear, and there's a little bit of a, kind of a way around that. But hopefully it's just a matter of maybe something that happened that you can fix, you can see. Other than that, the other thing I might do is this space in here seems like maybe it could be broken down a little bit more. It feels like quite a large space. Maybe put that pattern in there if you want to, or you could maybe just add a few more of these rays. That's I think it. Oh, and the other thing too is I would just continue this diagonal here. There's a little kind of piece taken out, and I would just fill that in with this lighter color. Maybe this little line here too. Looks like I would probably, just take that out, or yeah, anytime you have little lines in here. Okay, that's it. I think it looks really good, and it definitely exemplifies asymmetrical design. Yeah, I'm so glad that you are feeling more comfortable with the software. That is such a big part of it, because then you don't feel like you're struggling with it. And that's part of the reason, that we're using software in these classes, is that learning with basic shapes like this is really good foundation for whatever you do next with the software, whatever classes you take. Yeah, so this looks good. This is very asymmetric, and it looks like you're working with triangles and stripes, which is a good thing to do. It's kind of, again, that idea of creating a strategy. So in your case, it's like working with those two shapes, creating some bars, some vertical and horizontal bars. So the one thing I would do with this particular design is I would probably take off all of the strokes, like any of the outlines. In general, if you took all of my classes, anytime whatever class I teach, I always try to encourage students to take off strokes. It's because I think that what happens is they inhibit a design. They kind of like box things in there. They become like a stained glass window, and you kind of want things to flow and move instead of being sort of, kind of boxed in. Now, there are good reasons why you might want to outline things like the stained glass window, but in general, I think it's good to learn in design to take those strokes off. And that will also kind of allow you to see the shapes more clearly and also see how the shapes interact with one another, like against the colors against the other colors, if that makes sense. So if the colors, you know, if one of your shapes is maybe disappearing, I don't see any of that happening, but if you take off the stroke and it's disappearing, that's always a sign that you want to kind of maybe, you know, work with the contrast a little bit more. So that's what, and what happens with when you use outlines too is it adds another element of busyness to your design. And so your design feels like we're not quite seeing the structure of the design because we're seeing so many busy lines. So taking those off, you will then have a sort of a fresh appreciation of your design. So what I would do is I would look at your design without those and then keep experimenting, see if there's anything else that you may need to do. Like one thing I may see here, after I would first take them off, but one thing that you may need to do is it looks to me like this side may just be a little bit heavier than this side, and that's because you have such a large black triangle here. So you might experiment with that because, you know, the darker colors can be heavier. So you might, yeah, just play around with that a little bit and see, you know, see what happens. Yeah, I appreciate the comments on your process of wanting to balance with the color. Definitely color is a very strong part of the balance. You know, heavier colors, which most often are darker colors, but not always. They do tend to, again, look heavier, and I do think that you've done a nice job here with balancing this. Let's see here. I'm going to maybe, shall I open this in Photoshop? Yeah, so the Illustrator or Photoshop file that template that you're using, when you save it with these instructions, it should get rid of this. But if it doesn't, whatever reason, what you can do is you can do this in Photoshop or Illustrator. You can just hit this button with your, you know, you can open up the JPEG again, the crop tool, and just get rid of this. You know, you always want to have the focus on your design. And presentation, really, you can have a wonderful, wonderful design. But if your presentation, even if it's just a little bit, and I could probably crop off a little bit more on the left, but I'll leave it there. You know, even just a little bit with your, you know, your presentation being off means that it takes away from the work you've done, you know. So good presentation is worth a lot. Okay, yeah, so yeah, I think that you've done a nice job here at creating an asymmetric design. It does feel very balanced. I think you have two interesting kind of strategies here. So you've got the striped area here, and then the bubbly, you know, informal cloud of circles here. So what I would say to take this to the next level, I think it's good now, but if you wanted to keep working on it to really resolve it, I would say that what you want to be doing is to see how can you incorporate these two parts. Because right now it seems like they're different designs. Like how can you join them together? And in the student samples, let's go back to them. There happens to be a design that has a little bit of a sort of a similar idea where there's this kind of a grid, like a blocked out section, very strict, and then a kind of like a little bit more of a different approach here, which are these, like in this case, sort of a little bit triangles in a box. It's a little different approach. Now, how has this designer put them together? Well, in this case, you know, it has this part carried through behind the grid. That's just one possible way to do it. But you can see now it looks like one design rather than two separate designs. So what you could do here is something similar. You could maybe have some of these, like you have the circles all going across, you know, or what you could do is you maybe loosen these stripes up. Maybe you could have the stripes coming over, maybe at different places and endings, so they kind of maybe overlap the circles, or maybe the circles overlap the stripes. You know, so you can kind of think about how could I maybe carry them together, like kind of blending them in some way so that they have some kind of, you know, marriage between the two parts. Okay, so otherwise, I think that looks good. You know, again, keep experimenting, and always, try to aim for a design that really feels like everything belongs in its place, that you can't necessarily add something or take it away, which is always our kind of our holy grail of design. We don't always get there, but that's what we're sort of aiming to do. All right, good job.